Saudi officials allegedly have credible intelligence. It says an attack by Iran is imminent.
President Trump took the most aggressive path out of the deal, announcing the U.S. will reinstate the highest level of economic sanction on Iran.
Iran is planning to attack Saudi oil infrastructure.
Here we have two countries, the United States and Iran, continuing to be at loggerheads, even though we have a new US administration.
Iran can make a nuclear bomb. It's ready to make a nuclear bomb.
Tehran has the capacity to build a nuclear bomb.
We are looking to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon.
US senators were calling for a re-examination of the relationship. But then, Saudi Arabia told the US that Iran may be planning attacks against its oil facilities.
Hi everybody, the tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran are growing more and more intense by the day. And every single world leader, including the President of the United States, are keeping a very close eye on this conflict. This is because if this conflict escalates any further, it could shatter the entire world economy itself. And if you think this is just another random Middle Eastern conflict, I want you to have a look at this graph. This is the price chart of oil from 1970 to 2014. And here you will see that every time there is a conflict in the Middle East, the price of oil skyrockets by an average of 100%. This is because the Middle East alone controls 67% of the world's oil supply. And if you overlap this graph with the timeline of recession, you will see that every time this oil spike happens, it by default causes a recession, which then causes an economic nightmare all across the world. Therefore, if the Saudi-Iran conflict escalates, with the ongoing war effects, it's going to be a disaster both for India and the world itself. So in this case study today, let's try to understand what exactly is the issue between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Why has this conflict suddenly become dangerous because of US involvement? And lastly, how will this conflict affect the economy of India and the world itself? This video is brought to you by Cuckoo FM, but more on this at the end of the video. To understand this, we first have to understand the map and history of Middle East. You see, Saudi and Iran are two of the largest countries in the Middle East. Now, even though both are Muslim countries, while Iran is dominated by Shia Muslims, Saudi Arabia is dominated by Sunni Muslims. And this religious difference is stated as the root cause of their conflict. Now, if you look at other countries in the Middle East, they also have either Shia or Sunni majorities. As a result, these countries individually either align with Iran or Saudi Arabia. In this case, while Egypt, UAE and Bahrain are one team, Iran and Iraq are on the other team. Then we have other countries that are split between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which includes Yemen, Syria and Lebanon. And in between all this mess, we have Israel, which does not give a damn about any of these countries. Now the question over here is, both Saudi and Iran are oil-rich nations, right? While Saudi has the second largest oil reserve in the world, Iran has the fourth largest oil reserve in the world. But even then, if you look at the economies of both these countries, there seems to be a very evident contrast. While the GDP of Saudi Arabia has grown to $833 billion, Iran stands at just $231 billion. While Saudi's gross national income per capita stands at $47,700, in Iran it's just $15,760. The question is, in spite of both these countries being two of the largest countries in the Middle East, in spite of both these countries having the biggest oil reserve in the world, how is there such a wide difference in their economies? Well, this is why, ladies and gentlemen, the daddy of all world conflicts and wars comes in. And who is that? The United States of America.
The United States of America is the most powerful nation on earth.
And this big difference between Iran and Saudi is a result of how they reacted to American intrusion. So let's dive into Iran first. Now, if you remember from our Iraq case study, in the early 1900s, the Industrial Revolution in the US and Europe was picking up, and oil was becoming more and more important. But the problem was that oil had not been discovered in UAE, Dubai or Qatar. So Iran back then was one of the biggest suppliers of oil. This is when the Brits very cleverly established a joint venture with Iran called the Anglo-Iranian Company. And just like the East India Company exploited our indigo farmers in India, this company extracted oil from Iran and made a deal such that The Brits get 84% of the profit and the Iranian people get only 16% of the profits. So you see, this is a superb arrangement for the Brits. In spite of not having their own oil field, by using somebody else's oil field in somebody else's land, they still took away more than 80% of the profits. So it was practically a gold mine for these Brits. But this is when Iran saw the rise of a new prime minister with the name Mohammad Mossadegh. And on 15th of March 1951, he simply nationalized the entire oil industry of Iran and asked the Brits to get out of Iran. So suddenly, Iran was about to emerge as a powerful nation because they had complete control over one of the largest oil reserves in the world. But you know what? Suddenly, a coup was held, the Iranian people turned against Mossadegh, and this visionary leader was arrested. Now the question over here is, why did the people of Iran oust a man who was about to make them rich? Well, this is because the CIA and the Brits ran an anti-Mossadegh propaganda by which they portrayed Mohammad Mossadegh as a threat to the Shah of Iran. And once enough people believed it, they arranged a coup, took him off power and gave the power to an obedient puppet called Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. He was already the Shah of Iran, so the transfer of power was no big deal. And guess what? Suddenly, everybody forgot about the nationalization of oil, and in the next 25 years, the British and American companies set up their plants in Iran. These companies included Exxon, Gulf Oil, Mobil and Standard Oil of California. These companies started extracting oil by giving a mere 50% share of profits to Iran. So the US and Brits again made billions of dollars and started extracting from the oil reserves of Iran. This exploitation went for the next 20 years until a religious revolution sparked in Iran, and this overthrew the existing government. This is when a religious leader named Ayatollah Khomeini rose to power, and again, he kicked the US and Brits out and nationalized the oil industry of Iran. So guess what? We are back to square one, right? The US has lost control over both Iranian oil and the weapons trade with Iran. But by this time, that is by 1979, the world had already found oil in UAE, Saudi and Iraq. And out of all these countries, Iraq was in strong opposition to Iran and saw the emergence of a leader called Saddam Hussein. And this guy started the world-shaking Iran-Iraq war that went on for the next 9 years. So this time, instead of overthrowing the existing government in Iran, the United States sold weapons and funded Iraq to defeat Iran.
It was a very important year. 1982 was the year in which Ronald Reagan dropped Iraq from the list of states supporting terrorism so that the U.S. could start providing him with extensive aid, including military aid, including means to develop biological and chemical weapons and missiles and weapons and nuclear weapons.
So from 1983 onwards, Ronald Reagan, the then president of the United States, offered aid worth billions of dollars to Iraq. So as usual, people died on both sides, property was being damaged on both sides, economies of both these countries collapsed, but who made money? The United States of America. Why? Because they were able to extract oil and they were able to sell weapons. Then finally, after 8 years of war, 500,000 lives were lost, another million people were injured, and the economic cost of war exceeded $1 trillion, shattering the economies of both Iran and Iraq. And just like this, since Iran did not give in to the US conditions, their economy grew very, very slowly till 2000. Meanwhile, since Saudi Arabia was an ally of the US ever since the discovery of oil, their treatment was completely different. In 1938, oil was found in Saudi Arabia. In 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt declares Saudi oil to be vital for US security and provides financial support. In 1954, the King of Saudi agreed to sell oil in dollars in exchange for US security. So the US dollar becomes super powerful and Saudi had the protection of the United States of America. And by 1960, Saudi Arabia being the de facto leader of OPEC, all the Middle Eastern countries started selling oil in US dollars, and the US Army even set up a naval base in Saudi Arabia for the protection of this country. So Saudi Arabia never had to worry about its own protection and had developed without wars in its territory since the past 50 years. Now the question over here is, with all this, it's quite clear that Saudis are clearly super powerful as compared to Iran. So the question is, why is this conflict suddenly heating up now? Well, that is because, ladies and gentlemen, Iran is said to be building the mother of all weapons, which is a nuclear weapon.
The UN says Iran can make a nuclear weapon. It claims that Tehran has enough uranium for a bomb.
Iran's top advisors has claimed the country is capable of building a nuclear bomb.
A concerning development out of Iran, as an advisor to the Ayatollah Khamenei says the Islamic Republic is now capable of building a nuclear bomb.
And this is what brings me to one of the most important geopolitical projects in history, which is the Iranian nuclear program. And here's where I want you to observe the hypocrisy of the West very, very carefully. To put that straight, when the United States had the Shah of Iran as the puppet, US by itself helped Iran to create its nuclear program. This was to help them use nuclear power for peaceful purposes. But as soon as the government of their choice fell in 1979, the Iranian revolution started and the Iranians took the American embassy employees as hostage.
2 days earlier, several hundred young people, mainly students at Tehran University, had taken over the embassy. We are not occupiers, they said. We have thrown out the occupiers. Instead of chasing all the Americans out of the compound, the Iranians imprisoned them in a building somewhere on these grounds. They have been hostages ever since.
Our fellow citizen, whom you just saw bound and blindfolded, are now beginning their 6th day of captivity inside the U.S. Embassy in Tehran.
So obviously, the nuclear help to Iran was stopped. But even though the same Iran said that they were developing nuclear energies for civilian purposes, the same United States imposed sweeping sanctions on Iran.
Where our embassy has been seized and more than 60 American citizens continue to be held as hostages, our position must be clear. I am ordering that we discontinue purchasing of any oil from Iran for delivery to this country.
Today, the United Nations Security Council voted overwhelmingly to sanction Iran for its continued failure to live up to its obligations. This resolution will put in place the toughest sanctions ever faced by the Iranian government.
Will the U.S. lift sanctions first in order to get Iran back to the negotiating table?
No. The sanctions have bitten. Iran's economy is in freefall. Soaring inflation has even prompted the government to save 4 zeros off the value of the currency.
But you know what, guys? Even then, the Iranians kept on filling their nuclear reserves, because of which their uranium stock went from 0 in 2006 to almost 7,000 kilos in 2015. This is when the US agreed to lift the economic sanctions on Iran, provided they don't increase their uranium stockpile. So nuclear sanctions, as in only nuclear restrictions were applied on Iran and economic sanctions were lifted. This is what was agreed on something called the JCPOA. Now there's no need to get into the details of it, but if you need that, I'll give you the link in the description. Long story short, after Obama, Trump Baba came to power and he again imposed economic sanctions on Iran. And for some reason, he lifted the nuclear restrictions on Iran.
I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. In a few moments, I will sign a presidential memorandum to begin reinstating U.S. nuclear sanctions on the Iranian regime. We will be instituting the highest level of economic sanction.
So again, Iran's uranium stockpile started increasing. And then Biden rose to power and now he's again trying to lift the economic sanctions and only impose nuclear sanctions on Iran. And this is where, ladies and gentlemen, the Saudi kingdom has three big problems. Firstly, they're afraid that if the Iranian economic sanctions are lifted, Iranian oil will come into the global market. And if you remember, this is what Mr. Jaishankar raised the voice for.
Countries in Europe and the West and the United States are so concerned. Why don't they allow Iranian oil to come into the market? Why don't they allow Venezuelan oil to come into the market? I mean, they've squeezed every other source of oil we have. And then say, okay guys, you must not go into the market and guess the best deal for your people. I don't think that's a very fair approach.
So if the Iranian oil comes back into the market, they will have a huge say in the oil prices. So instead of Saudi single-handedly dominating the price of oil with OPEC, Iran could lead OPEC to decrease the oil prices. And that could be a big relief for the world. So Saudi's dominance in the OPEC will clearly be challenged. Secondly, because Iran will make more money, it will be able to fund its proxy war in Yemen and Syria, because of which Saudi's dominance in the Middle East will again get questioned. And by the way, this would also make Saudi even more dependent on US weapons for security. And thirdly, if Iran is able to win the proxy war in Syria, it will have access to the Mediterranean Sea and can design a shipping route without going full circle around the continent through the Suez Canal or through the Horn of Africa. This is the reason why Saudi Arabia is extremely angry at the US, and considering how bad these Middle Eastern conflicts are, it will only take a few loud bombings to start the war and put the entire world economy at risk. And this brings us to the last part of the episode, which is about how will this Saudi-Iran conflict affect the Indian economy. But before we move on, I want to quickly thank our partners Kuku FM for supporting our content. People, if you're someone who wants to know more about these geopolitical conflicts, and if you want to understand these case studies in depth, you must check out the Iran versus Iraq audio show on the Kuku FM app. Kuku FM is India's leading vernacular audio learning platform with over 1000 plus hours of content, with over 4.5 plus rating and a vast library of non-fiction content. You can listen to both business and geopolitical case studies in your own regional language through the Kuku FM app. And my favorite audiobooks in this app are The Greatest Salesman for Business and The Art of War for Geopolitics. So if these kind of subjects intrigue you, go ahead and download the Kuku FM app from the link in the description. And if you use the code THINK50, you can get 50% off on its annual subscription. And this is applicable only for the first 250 users. So go ahead and click the link in the description to download the Kuku FM app now. Moving on to the effects on the Indian economy. Firstly, if sanctions on Iran are lifted, the oil prices are expected to go down, which means they can soften the blow of the price hikes of the Russia-Ukraine war. Secondly, if this war escalates, it will cause more price hikes and will kill our economy's growth. So just because two random countries are fighting in the Middle East, the entire Indian economy has become a cat on the wall. And third and most importantly, because of the US going against Saudi could join our BRICS alliance and destroy the American dominance completely. And this is something that we'll talk about in the next episode, because this can literally change the world order of the 21st century itself. This is the context, story, and the repercussions of the Saudi-Iran conflict. That's all from my side for today, guys. If you learned something valuable, please make sure to hit the like button in order to make YouTube Baba happy. And for more such insightful business and political case studies, please subscribe to our channel. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.